He left me for being fat, the narrator says, and the image arrives before the explanation. A navy cocktail dress pulled at the hem of a marble staircase, a man cutting across the room with a practiced smile, and a woman standing at the edge of the crowd as if the light there were dimmer. That first sentence is a promise and a wound both, simple, stark, impossible to ignore. The rest of the night, the rest of the next 7 years, and the years after would bend around it. Laura was 33 the night the marriage began to undo itself. She had been married to Gabriel for 7 years, years of shared routines, divided bills, and a life that looked smooth from the outside. A 2-bedroom apartment in a glass building downtown, invitations to the right charity dinners, business lunches where Gabriel laughed a split second too loudly at the right jokes. He sold status as easily as he sold contracts. For him, the facade mattered. For Laura, the work mattered. She was a project manager by trade, meticulous, cool-headed, and often the quiet engine behind other people's polished presentations. That competence would be her refuge. For a long time, it was invisible. The networking event that cracked everything was one of those glossy city nights where the air smelled faintly of perfume and ambition. Gabriel had insisted she come. He told her, with the casual condescension of men who never learned restraint, that she would be his +1 and it would be good for both of them. She put on a navy dress, simple, flattering, a silk sheath that hugged where it pleased and let everything else be. She wore a strand of pearls he'd given her the first year they were married. She smoothed it twice in the mirror. Inside the venue, under the chandelier's cold light, the guest list shimmered. Board members, investors with discreet watches, women who wore curves like a proclamation, and men who mistook appetite for power. Gabriel never missed his cue. He greeted a senator with a kiss on the hand, slipped business cards with the precise weight of someone who measured worth in production and profit. When he came back, he noticed her, then didn't. Laura watched him pivot away, smile widening, hand on a woman's elbow, Monica, who looked like she lived in magazine margins. Gabriel introduced Monica to someone important with an intimacy that made it obvious the introduction was a performance. He laughed, loud and sure. He crossed the room as if he carried a trophy. It was an omission so small it could have been dismissed. A man at a party failing to acknowledge his wife is a human failing, yes, but what Gabriel did next was deliberate and corrosive. Later, very later, in a bathroom with fluorescence and tile that felt personal, Laura thought back to that gap in his attention, to the way his laughter lingered on someone else's name. She had no reason to expect the world to tilt. She only wanted to breathe. The phone buzzed in her purse. It was Gabriel's voice on the recording she had stumbled upon that night. Low, careful, dictating notes into his assistant's ear. Draft the introductory for the Monica pitch. She moves faster, looks the part. Laura, she's dead weight. We can't bring her into the client dinners. Dead weight. The words landed with the absurdity of a rock dropped into still water, and the ripples reached every inch of Laura's chest. Someone had been cataloging her. Someone had been weighing her like inventory. She pressed the phone to the mirror and listened again, as if another pass might translate the words into something else. An error, a trick of signal. Same voice, same rhythm. Then the room slid. The tile pressed against her heels, and the coldness of the sink seemed to reach through her ribs. The world tilted into a slow, infuriating spin. She remembers the hum of the ventilation, the fluorescence turning metallic. Her knees buckled. Her fingers knocked a small glass tumbler from the counter. It made a thin sound against ceramic. Nothing like thunder, but it became thunder in her ears. And then darkness. When she came back, she did not stumble into melodrama. There were no operatic confrontations. Life didn't offer a neat, cinematic revenge in the moment. She sat on the bathroom floor and felt the phone vibrate with more messages. Monica's laughter and speaking voice, a calendar invite for client dinner. Everything that was proof. The recording, so raw and intimate, became a ledger of betrayal. Laura replayed it with the steadiness of a professional auditing evidence. It was more than humiliation. It was a breach of contract in a marriage that had owed her basic respect. She could have dissolved into the cliché of rage or collapse into silence. Instead, she chose a different color: calculation. Not because she wanted to punish him for the spectacle of the offense, but because she was tired of being the story his life would tell. Divorce, for Laura, was an instrument, not a spectacle. She did it with precision. In the sterile light of a lawyer's office, with documents that smelled faintly of printed ink and authority, she signed what she needed to sign. Gabriel rang as if the world could still be arranged by charm. He attempted an apology that was more about inconvenience than remorse. "It's not like I said anything you didn't already know," he offered, the casual cruelty of someone who thinks bluntness excuses everything. Laura listened, and when she asked him to stop, he did. That is, stopped pretending. He left the office and left the marriage with a suitcase full of clothes and a practiced arrogance that had served him well. She filed the case with the evidence, the audio print, the calendar invites, the messages. Lawyers moved in, statutes and clauses sliding into place. The settlement was clean, financially independent, structured so she would not be reduced to a footnote in his success. Laura's decision was not vengeful in the petty sense. It was protective. She wanted firework, not fireworks. Still, in court, when the judge asked if either party had any objections, Gabriel's posture read like confession: thin, brittle, embarrassed. Outside the courthouse, as cab horns stitched the city together and office lights blinked like a second sky, Laura felt a hollow that was not sorrow exactly, but recognition, a sense that the map of her life had been redrawn without her consent. She had to remap her identity. To others, the divorce might have looked like a private tragedy. To Laura, it was a pivot point, a hinge rubbed raw by friction. She would use it to swing. She began to invest in herself the way she had always invested in other people's projects. To those who measure reinvention in purchases, this was the costly part: a tailored coat, shoes that made noise on marble, a foundation that didn't settle in the light. But the real work was quieter, the kind that doesn't snap into a photograph. She wanted training that would be armor, not a mask. She wanted to show the world her competence with the same confidence Gabriel had always worn like cologne. Isadora came into Laura's life like a composer rearranging a familiar melody. Isadora Vasconcelos had a reputation, a luxury stylist who specialized in plus-size clients with an unapologetic belief that high fashion belonged to every woman, regardless of size. She wore emerald as if it were a second skin, and she spoke with the directness of someone who'd learned to see beyond fear. Her atelier smelled of steam and citrus and the weight of silk. "You're not changing who you are," Isadora said the first time they met, circling Laura slowly like a tailor measuring fabric with eyes. "You're teaching the world how to read you." It was said without flattery and without pity. Isadora's approach was an education. She taught Laura to think of clothing the way a negotiator thinks of language, not as decoration, but as deliberate choice with consequence. Fittings became lessons: a seam here, an altered waistline there, a color consultation. Isadora favored deep navy, rich emeralds, and a contrast of white that framed the face. They spoke in textures: cashmere for calm, silk for evenings when she wanted movement under lights, a compact of satin laid across the cheek like a promise. Isadora introduced Laura to etiquette coaching, how to command a room without hollering, how to make an entrance feel like a simple fact, how to stand so shoulders read as authority, not aggression. Oratory lessons taught her the cadence to carry numbers and plans like a story people wanted to invest in. But the transformation was not only external. Laura worked with a small circle, a voice coach who taught breath control until her sentences landed like measured steps on marble, a mentor from her industry who taught her to translate competence into narratives investors could follow, a yoga teacher who taught posture as an argument in favor of dignity. These were practical investments, deliberately chosen. Isadora trained her to view accessories like punctuation, an engagement ring as a period that could underline commitment, a brooch as an exclamation of taste. In the mirror, Laura began to see not someone to be corrected, but someone to be acknowledged. The montage of her reinvention could have easily slipped into cliché, stitches, shopping bags, slow motion, but the more profound moments were quieter. A nightside phone call with an old professor who said, "You always had the instincts of a leader," and then sent a contact at a tech incubator. Laura drafting precise emails at 2 in the morning because deadlines are democratic and do not care about heartbreak. A meeting with Dr. Roberto, an old college mentor, who provided an introduction to a venture firm without dramatics, just a note that read, in essence, "She is reliable." Those brief endorsements were as solid as any ring. There were social lessons. Isadora escorted her to salons where appearances mattered, but Laura's goal was never to be a trophy. She did not want to be a polished thing for display. Instead, she sought the rooms where decisions were made, where people with capital met people with competence. Etiquette and fashion gave her access. Once inside, she used the rest of her training: the ability to listen, the skill to ask the right question at the right time, the patience to let others reveal their weaknesses. In a week, she was at a charity event that counted as both runway and audition. The room was an orchestra of power: city leaders, philanthropists, and executives. Laura wore an emerald gown Isadora had recommended, silk that moved like thought, and her hair was pulled back so her face read as an argument. She did not enter to be admired. She entered because opportunity had an address, and she intended to deliver the letter. That night, she met people kindly, learned their names, and left with one card that mattered more than the rest. It belonged to a man named Victor Drummond, a principal in a firm investing in technology and ventures, a magnate whose reputation suggested both restraint and quiet generosity. He was not ostentatious. He spoke in sentences that made things larger and smaller at once, the way someone does when they know what is worth attending to and what is not. He complimented her not on dress, but on something she had said about a nonprofit's growth strategy earlier in the evening. And that compliment felt like currency, one you could spend honestly. Before he was Victor, he was, to himself, a man who had built trust slowly, and who had learned to value the brains behind good ideas. The chemistry between them felt domestic and rare, curiosity and respect without the hunger that had marked other entanglements in Laura's past. For the first time since the bathroom light had narrowed into a rectangle of shame, she felt seen for decisions and intelligence, not just for the way her clothes fit. But these moments of newness, fittings and introduced acquaintances, a corrected walk through a marble lobby, were not a narrative of revenge. Laura's politics were subtler. She was not staging an assault on Gabriel's dignity. She was constructing a life where his absence meant nothing more than a closed door. Still, there was a small private satisfaction in the sleek efficiency of her choices. The year she kept her expenses balanced, the precise contract clauses that protected her finances, and the email that sent the audio print, redacted and annotated, to her lawyer with the kind of professional detachment she reserved for spreadsheets. Elegance, she learned, has teeth. The emerald color of her gown that night pulled a man's eye in the corner and a boardroom chair to stand straighter in expectation. Every accessory read like punctuation. A single ring glinted, not because it announced the future, but because it declared the present. This woman was taken by plans, by standards, by a life she had chosen anew. As Laura moved through her new orbit, small things began to happen. Invitations to roundtables, an email introducing her to a product manager searching for someone who understood how to translate concept into market. A short-term consulting gig that led to a glowing recommendation from a mid-level executive. These were not meteors, they were ledger entries made of honest work. Slowly, not loudly, her reputation shifted. She cultivated friendships that did not demand smallness from her body or ideas. Isadora became both confessor and strategist, telling truth without tenderness, a rare commodity. "You don't need them to admit you're right," Isadora said once, pressing fabric into Laura's palms. "You need them to need you." That phrasing annoyed Laura at first. Need can be possessive, but she understood the point. Create value in ways that others cannot ignore. In the quiet hours between fittings and late-night strategic calls, she thought about Gabriel often, but not as a man to dismantle. She thought of him as a past clause in a contract she'd signed without reading. He had left, he had chosen spectacle over substance. Those choices were his. Her response would be different. By winter, Laura had built a small platform of authority. She spoke at a panel about inclusive hiring and the language of performance metrics. She moderated a discussion on product market fit where she asked pointed questions and let numbers answer. She learned how to make the room arrive at her conclusions as if they had discovered them themselves. It was a strange and powerful craft, leadership disguised as facilitation. Word traveled, slowly, in the manner of good things, and large doors began to open. One afternoon, an email appeared with a subject line that read simply, "Drumon Ventures, Exploratory Conversation." Laura's heart did a regulated flip. It was not surprise. She'd been steering toward such outcomes. But there was a new steadiness to the way she experienced it. This was not revenge being served. This was recognition. To Gabriel's circles, it might look like she'd risen. To those who had witnessed her work, it looked like a logical next step. The city, meanwhile, kept its indifferent pace. Gossip churned and settled. Gabriel's orbit had its own motion. He moved on to someone younger almost before the courtroom doors had closed. A brief alliance that crumbled under the weight of his own caprice. Laura heard the rumors, names, small betrayals, a reputation for haste. She did not gloat. The public humiliation that would eventually come was not her project. Her project was to build a life so coherent no one could undermine it with gossip. She taught herself a new kind of silence. And then the invite arrived. A midwinter gala hosted by a philanthropic consortium that often served as both social lubrication and networking hub. Laura considered not going. Part of her wanted to avoid the spectacle of the city's social carousel, but she also knew that absence sometimes looked like retreat. Isadora gave her the look that had become a kind of benediction. Go. She chose an emerald gown with a minimalist silhouette, the kind that makes shoulders look like decisions. She practiced the way she would enter the room, not with arrogance, but with a quiet authority that reads as comfort in your own story. At the gala, music threaded the space. The lighting was warm enough to be flattering and impartial enough to reveal the truth of faces. Laura moved like someone who had rehearsed the small courtesies of adulthood until they felt natural. She greeted people by name, asked about their initiatives, listened with concentration that was itself a compliment. People noticed it. Some admitted later they did not remember what she had said, but remembered that they had felt heard. Across the room, separated by a cavern of chatter and a buffet table the size of a small country, a man watched from the periphery. Victor Drummond was quiet by design. His attention was precise as a scalpel. He had the unflashy quality of someone who recognized long-term patterns where others sought immediate triumphs. When he later told people what struck him about Laura that night, he would say, "She was interested in the work, not the applause." He came over after a speaker referenced a growth model that Laura had criticized earlier, a brittle fantasy masquerading as scalability. Their conversation started with the model, moved to the grant structure of a nonprofit, and then, almost without intention, into territory that felt like partnership. At the gala, music threaded the space. The lighting was warm enough to be flattering and impartial enough to reveal the truth of faces. Laura moved like someone who had rehearsed the small courtesies of adulthood until they felt natural. She greeted people by name, asked about their initiatives, listened with concentration that was itself a compliment. People noticed it. Some admitted later they did not remember what she had said, but remembered that they had felt heard. Across the room, separated by a cavern of chatter and a buffet table the size of a small country, a man watched from the periphery. Victor Drummond was quiet by design. His attention was precise as a scalpel. He had the unflashy quality of someone who recognized long-term patterns where others sought immediate triumphs. When he later told people what struck him about Laura that night, he would say, "She was interested in the work, not the applause." He came over after a speaker referenced a growth model that Laura had criticized earlier, a brittle fantasy masquerading as scalability. Their conversation started with the model, moved to the grant structure of a nonprofit, and then, almost without intention, into territory that felt like partnership. They spoke for 20 minutes that felt like a negotiation and a confession. He listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words were precise. The energy between them was not the sudden flare of intoxication, but the deliberate pull of two people who could imagine working together. When Victor asked if she had ever considered running projects inside a venture firm, Laura gave him an answer that was careful and frank. She would consider it only if she retained decision-making authority and clear limits. She would not be a figurehead. This was alliance language. Victor smiled, less like charm than like recognition, and asked for her card. As the night dissolved into a late rush of dessert and goodbye hugs, Laura stepped outside into the cold and breathed. The city smelled of winter and exhaust, and she felt a small surge of gratitude that was almost laughable in its ordinariness. She had not come to be rescued. She had come carrying the ledger of her competence, the fashion that had become a form of translation, and the quiet aim of someone no longer willing to be overlooked. It would be easy to call this a beginning, and in some ways it was. But beginnings are messy, and they are not linear. Laura had not yet married a magnate or ruined any man's day. She had simply, deliberately shifted the axis of her life. The next steps were not yet clear, but they were no longer unknowable. The phone buzzed in her clutch as she stood under the streetlight. A message, terse and inevitable. Gabriel had emailed asking to meet, an old motif reappearing with new clothes. The message was short, apologetic, clumsy. His timing was typical of people who think remorse can be purchased with contact. Laura looked at the message, then at the city skyline, then at the photograph she kept of her own hand on a freshly pressed sleeve. She deleted the message, an act that to anyone else would look small. To her, it was decisive. She had the audio print in a file folder at home, the same folder with her legal papers and the letters from Dr. Roberto that vouched for her professionalism. Those documents were not talismans, they were tools. She had learned the importance of evidence, of clarity, of not being a story told by someone else. Inside her coat pocket, the emerald silk fluttered as she walked. There was no exultant trumpet of revenge. There was instead a patient satisfaction, the kind that comes from building rather than breaking. She had folded herself into a new architecture, work, dignity, and friendships that recognized the whole of her. When she finally walked back into the apartment that night, it was not to brood. She opened a folder and began to make notes, outlines of projects, people she might call, points she wanted to raise the next time someone tried to reduce her to a single word. She wrote like someone who had been given permission to speak to her own life in the language of ambition. There would come a time for confrontation, for boardrooms where numbers and risk assessments would be laid bare. There would be a time when Gabriel, who once dismissed her as dead weight, would find himself standing on the same stage of commercial consequence, seeking the very partnerships he had once mocked her for not making. But not that night. That night, Laura made a list, contacts to cultivate, workshops to lead, and a single sentence she underlined twice. Live by competence, lead with clarity. A week later, an email from Victor arrived with a request for coffee. She accepted. The first meeting was exploratory. The second was practical. He asked smart questions about project roadmaps and risk mitigation. She answered with the same cool precision Gabriel had always admired in her work, but seldom respected at home. Somewhere in their exchanges, a partnership began to take shape. Not the kind negotiated with applause and grand gestures, but the steady architecture of mutual respect. Gabriel, in the meantime, continued his small slide. The relationship he'd flitted into did not last. His phone calls grew fewer and more frantic. He called, he texted, he sent half-hearted messages, which she mostly deleted. It is tempting to narrate his decline with relish. The truth is messier. People decline for reasons we assign to them, but Laura learned not to cheer from the sidelines. She let the world take its course while she built herself up. Her reinvention, however, did not make her invulnerable. There were nights when the old recordings found their way back to her mind, and she had to hold herself like someone steadying a lamp in a storm. But she had allies now. Isadora would call and say, "Tomorrow we present at a small round table. You will be concise." Dr. Roberto sent her a short email with a link to a venture report and 3 observations. Each note was small and practical, and in aggregate they formed scaffolding. On a Tuesday morning, she opened an email that would draw a faint line between what she'd been and what she might become. Victor's assistant requested a formal meeting with a small group to discuss a potential director role for new projects. Laura read the message twice. She set the cup of coffee down carefully, as if tending a tiny engine. She called Isadora, and then Dr. Roberto, and then sat down to prepare. This was where competence met choreography. It required everything she had been building, her voice, her wardrobe, and the thin armor of dignity she'd stitched onto her life. She reviewed the documents, and the memory of the bathroom came back to her with the same clarity as when she had first heard the audio. The sting of those words, dead weight, would always be there like a scar. Scars are reminders, not identities. Laura had decided long ago she would not let that phrase compose her life. Across town, Gabriel looked at his own phone and dialed a number he had not once called in months, the number of an investor who had once nodded at his ideas. His tone was swift and practiced, full of the old assumption that charm can navigate any ledger. He had not yet realized the difficulty of asking for a seat at a table when the woman you once discarded now holds the pen. Laura prepared for the meeting with the same methodical attention she had always given to large projects. She practiced transitions. She prepared questions that would reveal assumptions. She set boundaries. She would not be a yes woman. She would not accept prestige without power. The city outside her window continued to be indifferent. Inside her notes, it began to tilt toward possibility. When she closed the folder and stood, the city glittered like an accusation and a promise. An invitation to a new type of life had arrived in her inbox. It would require nerve and discipline, alliances and stubborn patience. It would also demand that she remain, above all, herself. As she left the apartment, closing the door on the last legal papers she would sign with the neatness of a signature that sealed a life chapter, she did not look back. The echo of the bathroom's fluorescent light lingered, but it was now a reference point, not a cage. She slid the phone into her clutch, feeling the weight of small evidences and greater resolve. Tonight would be another rehearsal, another meeting that could change trajectory. Something else was shifting too. In a different part of town, Gabriel typed a message he had never thought to send before, an entreaty to a man named Victor Drummond, asking for a preliminary conversation about investment. He did not know then that his path and Laura's had already touched in the most inconsequential of ways. A card exchanged at a gala, a compliment about a nonprofit. And that small thread would tug tighter in the days to come. Laura stepped into the evening with a steadiness that surprised her. This stability wasn't denial of the old pain, it was architecture. She had built a life that could stand up to the old story. The kind of victory she sought was not spectacle, but a life arranged with intention. The city watched, indifferent as always, but the way she carried herself had a new, quiet consequence. She walked toward the meeting place, not toward a battle. Whatever the future would bring, conversations with Victor, proposals to be evaluated, the eventual moment when Gabriel might stand before her in a corporate room asking for mercy, she would meet it as the woman who had been left for being fat and who, after the dark, had learned to map her own climb. The meeting room at Drummond Ventures smelled faintly of lemon and new paper. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a map, and the light cut through the glass with a clean, indifferent precision, the kind of light that makes every decision look like an answer. Laura arrived with a folder under her arm and a quiet steadiness she kept practicing at home, shoulders relaxed, eyes forward, voice ready. Small CTA, if this story is resonating with you, take a moment now, like the video and subscribe. Tell us in the comments if you've ever been judged for how you look. It helps others find a place where they aren't defined by someone else's measuring stick. Victor greeted her in the lobby with the same deliberate calm she had noticed the night they met. He wore a navy suit that read restraint. An unpretentious watch peeked from his wrist. They walked through the corridors of the firm, artfully sparse, with plants that looked like sculptures, toward the office where new ideas were tested like hypotheses. "Before we talk about roles," Victor said as they reached the conference room, "tell me what you need to own." It wasn't an offer disguised as flattery. It was an invitation to set terms. Laura named what she had already decided: autonomy over projects she led, veto rights on key partnerships that posed reputational risk, a clear path for transparent reporting to the board, and the authority to build the team she believed in. It was a contract language she translated from years of project management. Her requests were professional, not emotional. Victor listened, nodded, and smiled, a small, genuine expression of agreement. "Those are reasonable," he said. "I want you to have the scope to do the job you think needs doing." Their negotiation was short and precise. Laura took the role of director of new projects with a clause that made her independence explicit. She was not accepting an ornament title. She was stepping into a seat with a pen that could sign or decline. She left the meeting with a small, private satisfaction, a workplace that matched the terms of her dignity. Her first months at Drummond Ventures were a blur of steep learning and deliberate application. She read product decks with the same scrutiny she had once reserved for other people's timelines. She assembled a small team, a product strategist who thought in modular systems, a legal counsel who loved conditions, an operations manager with a taste for scalable processes. She insisted on metrics that could not be dressed up by charm: retention curves, unit economics, independent audits, clear go-no-go milestones. She taught her team to treat forecasts like maps rather than promises. Laura's leadership had texture. She would walk into a room wearing a tailored suit that read authority as easily as the sentences she chose to speak. She sometimes thought of Isadora's phrasing, clothing as language, and smiled. Power could be quiet as silk or as loud as a brocade cuff, depending on the argument you were making. Laura's argument was competence. In the meantime, the city continued to separate consequences from intention. Gabriel's path tightened. The new relationship he had hoped would be a festival of social proof collapsed under its own fragility. A contract he had touted as his next big win fell through when his primary lead withdrew. Rumors, small at first, then louder, began to circle him. Clients expect a certain kind of steadiness. They do not always forgive a man who markets himself on image but delivers on thin margins. He did what he had always done when his orbit cracked. He dialed other people's doors for entry. One late afternoon, when the lights in his apartment felt colder than they used to, he sent an email to Drumon Ventures requesting an exploratory meeting, language of necessity thinly disguised as aspiration. It was a story he had told before: new product, pivot, big potential. He had not realized that he might need to negotiate with Laura. When his assistant called to schedule a pitch, he expected the old arrangement: an investor's nod, a handshake, a faux commitment to be polished later. He did not register the name on the calendar that had the authority to say yes or no: Laura Campos, Director of New Projects. He did not imagine the awkwardness of walking into a glass room where the woman he had once dismissed would be the one conducting the conversation. The morning of Gabriel's pitch, the boardroom hummed with a ceremonial quiet. A long table stretched under the city light. Glasses of water reflected the skyline like small obedient moons. Gabriel carried himself with a practiced ease, his voice lubricated by charm. He opened with numbers set to sound like propulsion: projected users, partnership whispers, a runway of supposed growth. He had a PowerPoint that glowed with confidence and a smile that expected return. Laura watched him for several beats before she spoke. She didn't begin with moral pronouncements, did not read him his past. She began with what every investor wants first: clarity. "Walk me through your customer acquisition cost on a per-channel basis," she said. The question was clinical. It was also lethal. Gabriel's smile faltered before the words did. The figures on his slide were not lies so much as hopeful math, assumptions that inflated expected conversions without accounting for churn, for customer retention, for the cost of marketing that actually worked. Laura followed the thread. His projected lifetime value ignored a major operating expense. A vendor relationship was verbally guaranteed, but without contracts, and a market claim he'd made to the press had no data to support it. She asked for sources, timelines, audits. He offered a narrative. She asked again. There was a moment when a room can measure someone by silence. Investors shifted in their chairs. A senior partner on the board pulled up a spreadsheet and cross-checked a number. A lawyer noted missing due diligence paperwork. Laura's questions did more than expose numbers. They exposed a pattern of posturing that could not survive scrutiny. At no point did she degrade him for his human failings. She separated the pitch from the man and treated the document like a problem to be solved or declined. Gabriel tried to charm his way through a series of optimistic answers until he reached the place where hope and numbers no longer met. The board's faces closed like books. Given the risk profile and the lack of verifiable metrics, Laura said, Drumon Ventures will not be moving forward with this investment at this time. It was professional, deliberate, final. Gabriel's response was 2 parts indignation and thinly veiled plea. He tried to pivot to relationships, to mutual history. He mentioned shared contacts, a promise he'd made. He did not realize that the name he invoked, the one who had offered him a kind of social roof, now sat across the table. Victor's expression was not triumph. It was agreement to the board's due diligence. He had built a firm where decisions were not based on charisma, but on evidence. Gabriel had brought the wrong currency. When Gabriel realized the depth of refusal, the color left his face. The room, which had the texture of a theater, suddenly had an audience for a small tragedy. He left with a collected stack of slides, shaking fingers, the practiced charm stripped down to blunt admission. Outside the building, in the winter light that had once made Laura feel small in a bathroom stall, Gabriel sent messages, requests for reconsideration, thin apologies, last-ditch offers of revised terms. She read them, archived them, and let them rest there like unread invoices. There was no public spectacle. There was a quiet reckoning that would ripple into his social circles. People who had once taken his word as currency began to ask for receipts. Word of the decision traveled exactly as sober truths do, slowly, then inevitably. A few polite emails circulated. A comment from a colleague noted that due diligence had saved money. Gabriel felt the contraction of a man who had been counting on being carried by other people's impressions. He reached for the familiar scripts, apology, rebrand, promise, but the boardroom had already decided. The humiliation that followed for Gabriel was not manufactured by Laura. It was the market's response to unvetted claims. He tried to recoup footing in the small events where he once shone, but confidence depends on a ledger. His entries read thin. He called old clients. He sent proposals with trimmed numbers and more humility than he had ever shown publicly. At home, in the quiet that replaced the late-night buzz he used to chase, Gabriel tried to write a message that would land. He called the old number, Laura's, and when she didn't pick up, he left something that sounded like pleading. He used words that tried to compress months of irresponsibility into a syllable of regret. She read it over coffee and set the phone down. There was no anger. There was a steady indifference that felt like the conclusion of a sentence. Time, as it often does, rearranged itself. The season turned towards spring. Laura and Victor grew close on a different axis. They talked about product roadmaps and philanthropic commitments with the same tenderness. He admired the way she asked hard questions, how she turned risk into a discipline rather than drama. Their engagement was small and private first, an exchange of promises under a winter tree, a ring that glinted with quiet geometry. Victor's proposal was not a spectacle. It was a statement of partnership. He proposed because he wanted to choose her daily, publicly and privately, and she accepted because trust had been built in the trenches of work and shared values. The wedding they planned was tasteful and intentional. It was held in a hotel that had once been a site of other people's grandeur. Now it was the backdrop for something steady. Laura chose a white couture gown with a minimalist line. Isadora had insisted on a cut that read like a clear sentence. The ring Victor placed on her finger was a design of restrained brilliance, a small sun that fit the sway of her hand. On the day of the ceremony, the air hummed with the soft orchestration of silk and calm. Guests filled the room, colleagues from Drummond Ventures, friends she had made in boardrooms and salons, Isadora with a small smile, Dr. Roberto with the kind expression of a mentor who had long seen this coming. And, as fate aligns with the theater of social life, Gabriel arrived late. He stood against the back wall for a while, looking at a life he had once thought would be a museum of his own image. Victor's speech at the reception read like a careful argument. He spoke first of the work they did together, of the projects that had taught them to measure value beyond surface. He thanked Laura not for being beautiful, but for being rigorous, for making him a better leader. Then, with a composure that felt surgical in its gentleness, he folded in a broader observation. "We live in cultures that assign weight to things that are not worth weighing," he said, voice steady. "There are people who measure others by shape or by the ornaments they wear, and they call that metric wisdom. But intelligence, steadfastness, and moral courage are not visible from an angle of fashion. They are proven by decisions, not displays. The audience followed, sensing the direction of the remark. Victor did not name Gabriel. There was no need. The point landed like a bell. Value is not decided by those who profit from appearances. He toasted the room to partnerships grounded in evidence and to a life built by mutual respect. Later that evening, someone would recount how Gabriel's face had turned as the language unfolded, a private audience reading its own indictment. He tried, between courses, to catch Laura's eye. He asked to speak. The staff, with practiced etiquette, said the couple wished to keep certain moments private. He lingered on the periphery, and at one point he approached, voice low and urgent. "Laura," he said, "I was wrong. She listened. The city outside continued its indifferent hum. Inside the room, guests were writing the social ledger again. Laura could have answered. She had the language to craft a public rebuke or an intimate explanation. Instead, she felt something precise, a calm that had cost her nights and hard work, not a short spiral of satisfaction. "Look," she said, her voice level but not unkind, "I don't need you to explain. What you need is to understand that your choices have consequences. I've learned to live with mine." There was no drama, no theatrical denial. It was a closure that refused to be performative. Gabriel tried once more, the classic late plea for forgiveness that attempts to shrink time into a single word. And Laura, with the composure of someone who has rewritten her life chapter by chapter, chose silence. Not hatred, not forgiveness. Indifference, finally, was the cleanest answer. It was the kind of response that allowed her to conserve energy for work that mattered. After the wedding, Laura set her attention towards something that made the victory meaningful beyond the narrow polygon of personal vindication. She founded a small initiative within Drummond Ventures, a mentorship program that partnered with organizations to create transparent hiring metrics, inclusive design standards, and leadership training for women whose voices had been marginalized for reasons of appearance. She called it, quietly, the Measure Project, a name that refused to reduce people to the wrong scales. The program did not promise miracles. It offered tools, workshops on presenting data, funding for small pilots that tracked outcomes by clear metrics, a scholarship for leadership training, and a convening that brought HR leaders together to discuss inclusion with fiscal rigor. Laura led panels where she described how to translate competence into compelling proposals and how to design processes that rewarded performance rather than pivoting on perception. She mentored junior product managers who had been told their bodies made them unsuitable for leadership. She taught them to document, to insist on audits, to speak in numbers that could not be ignored. Her work became, in itself, a kind of testimony. Women came to her with proposals and left with annotated decks and a confidence sharpened by practice. She introduced them to investors who valued substance. She pushed partners to adopt outcome-based contracts that reduced bias by design. Her influence was not a thunderclap, but a set of small, cumulative changes. A hiring rubric here, a measurable KPI that replaced vagueness there. These were the instruments of long-term justice. Occasionally, someone in the industry would remark on the arc of her life, how a woman who had once been dismissed for her size now led a program that reshapes who gets to pitch to whom. The tone of these remarks varied. Some congratulated her, some watched with the candid curiosity of those who still equate spectacle with worth. She learned to accept the compliments without letting them become her definition. Gabriel's attempts to return to relevance slowed into quieter tones. He would appear at smaller events with a new, more cautious pitch and a visible humility that wasn't entirely bad for him. He reached out a final time, an email that asked for a meeting for advice on rebuilding. Laura read it, then forwarded it to a nonprofit that specialized in advising founders on sound financial practices. She did not reply directly. Her refusal to engage personally with Gabriel's later entreaties was not cruelty. It was, instead, a boundary she had learned to draw. The past could inform but not define present obligations. She had built a life that did not require his approval, and she had built systems that would help others secure their worth without needing to be measured by strangers. A few years later, Laura stood on a stage at a conference on inclusive venture investing. Cameras picked up the texture of her suit, the glint of her ring, the calm of a woman who had learned to translate pain into policy. She told an audience about the small mechanics that made hiring fairer, about the need to insist on transparent numbers, about how mentorship is not a favor but infrastructure. "Rejection leaves a mark," she said to the room, voice steady and low. "But we can choose what kind of mark it becomes, scar or signpost. A scar is private. A signpost becomes instruction." People nodded. She had learned to speak in sentences that left room for others to insert themselves. Her final lines were personal and practical both. If someone has ever told you that you are less because of your body, remember that those words measure them, not you. Build your ledger. Keep your evidence. Seek rooms where numbers matter more than noise. The room clapped, soft at first, then louder. And afterward, people came forward not to fetishize her story, but to ask practical questions. How to design hiring rubrics, how to insist on audits, and how to mentor with dignity. She answered them with the same precision she had used in a boardroom: clear tools, named resources, contacts for training. Her life had shifted from personal revenge to structural change. At home, in the quiet moments when the city was only a low pulse, Laura sometimes thought about what it meant to be spared the need for spectacle. She had married the man Gabriel had begged to be business partners with, not as a conquest, but as a partnership built on mutual respect and shared values. That reality tasted of a different victory, one that did not humiliate a rival so much as erase the space he once occupied in her life. The audio print, the thing that had started everything, sat in a locked file, no longer because she needed it for leverage, but as a reminder of why she had set boundaries in the first place. She kept Isadora's phrase close: "Teach the world how to read you." She had done that. She wore clothing that read competence, but she had taught herself first. The rest followed: respect, work, a life of practical beauty. In the end, the story was not about proving someone right or wrong in the cruel arithmetic of appearances. It was about proving to herself that a life could be rebuilt with clarity, dignity, and work that mattered. He had left her for being fat. She had married the man he begged to be business partners with. The arc was satisfying, not because of the humiliation it brought to him, but because it marked a life chosen and a mission begun. If this resonated with you, share your story in the comments. One sentence is enough. Subscribe for more stories about people who turn rejection into a map, and share this video with someone who needs to hear that competence, not image, should be the measure of worth.